You wake up every morning feeling like you are carrying a heavy backpack that you did not pack yourself. And the strangest part is that you cannot even explain why, because on paper, everything looks completely fine since your parents fed you and clothed you and told you they love you. So why does your chest feel this hollow ache that never seems to go away? Before we go any further, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button and leave a comment down below telling me if you have ever felt like you had to earn love instead of just receiving it freely, because that feeling sits at the very center of what we are about to unpack together today. The uncomfortable truth nobody discusses around the dinner table is that sometimes the people who are meant to be your safest place can also be the quiet source of a sadness that follows you everywhere, like a shadow you never asked for. We are going to walk through 8 signs that your parents might be contributing to your depression, each backed by real research, so you can finally put a name to that heavy feeling and start figuring out what comes next. The first sign is growing up in a home where feelings were treated like unwanted guests that everyone politely ignored. Dr. Jonas Webb calls this childhood emotional neglect, and her research shows the damage happens not through harmful actions, but through the absence of emotional validation, teaching a child that their inner world simply does not matter. A simple example is coming home after being teased and trying to tell your mom only to hear you are fine, just ignore them. And in that tiny moment, you learned your pain was invisible. How to deal with it is to practice self-validation by saying out loud what you feel without judgment, because you have to reparent that little kid inside you who never heard the words, "Your feelings are real." The second sign is feeling like you are tiptoeing on eggshells because you never know which version of your parent is walking through the door. Dr. Lindsay Gibson documented how emotionally immature parents cannot regulate their own emotions, forcing the child into constant hypervigilance that exhausts the nervous system and leads directly to anxiety and depression. A simple example is pausing at the front door after school to listen for the tone of their voice, because you need to know within seconds whether tonight will be safe or whether you need to make yourself small and quiet. How to deal with it is to recognize that you are not responsible for managing anyone else's emotional weather system, because their storms are not a reflection of your worth. The third sign is having a relentless inner critic that sounds exactly like your parent and never runs out of things to criticize. Research by Dr. Jill Hooley, published in the Journal of Abnormal Child Psychology, shows that children exposed to high parental criticism internalize that voice until it becomes permanent background noise. And even well-intentioned comments about doing better accumulate into a mountain of self-doubt. A simple example is getting a 92% on a test and feeling proud for 4 seconds before hearing your parent's voice asking what happened to the other 8%. How to deal with it is to name that inner critic Brenda or Carl, and when it starts talking, you say, "Thank you for your input, but I am not taking feedback right now," because creating distance from the thought reduces its power. The fourth sign is struggling to make simple decisions without a wave of anxiety, because you learned that making the wrong choice would lead to disappointment. Developmental psychologist Diana Baumrein's research on authoritarian parenting shows that high demands combined with low responsiveness produce children who struggle with autonomy because they were never allowed to practice making choices safely. A simple example is standing in the cereal aisle as a fully grown adult and feeling paralyzed between 2 boxes because you are still waiting for someone to tell you which one is right. How to deal with it is to start with low-stakes decisions and refuse to second-guess yourself, because the goal is rebuilding the muscle of trusting your own preferences. The fifth sign is feeling overwhelming guilt whenever you do something just for yourself because you were raised to believe prioritizing your own needs was selfish. Dr. Gregory Jurkovich and Dr. Lisa Hooper studied parentification and found that when children must care for their parents' emotional needs, they learn their own needs are irrelevant and they only have value when giving to others. A simple example is feeling a knot of anxiety about taking a weekend trip with friends because you imagine your parent being lonely without you, and the guilt feels so heavy you almost cancel. How to deal with it is to practice self-compassion by putting your hand on your heart and saying it is not selfish to take care of me because I cannot pour from an empty cup. The sixth sign is feeling like you are never truly seen by your parents because they interact with a version of you that exists only in their imagination. Dr. Brian Barber and Dr. Wendy Grolnick studied psychological control and found that parents who use guilt induction and love withdrawal create children who feel fundamentally unseen and grow up with a fractured identity from years of performing to keep the peace. A simple example is coming home excited about a new hobby only to have your parent barely acknowledge it before steering the conversation back to their expectations. How to deal with it is to find at least one person outside your family with whom you can be completely yourself, because even one relationship where you feel seen protects against depression. The seventh sign is feeling constant pressure to achieve, not because it brings joy, but because you are terrified of falling short. Dr. Avi Asor and Dr. Guy Roth studied conditional parental regard and found that when love is conditional on achievement, children develop contingent self-esteem, where their worth is tethered to external markers, an exhausting way to live because the goalposts never stop moving. A simple example is getting into a good college and feeling brief relief only to realize they are already asking about grades and internships, and you understand you will run this race forever unless you choose to stop. How to deal with it is to separate your own values from the ones handed to you and ask, what would I want to do with my life if nobody was watching and nobody was keeping score? The eighth sign is having a deep belief that you are fundamentally unlovable and that anyone who saw the real you would leave. This traces back to attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth, whose research shows that children who receive inconsistent or conditional emotional responsiveness develop insecure attachment patterns that follow them into adulthood and increase their risk for depression because they learned love must be earned. A simple example is pushing people away when they get too close because a wounded part of you is convinced they will discover your hidden flaw and leave anyway. So it feels safer to leave first. How to deal with it is to begin offering yourself unconditional regard for your own messy humanity, starting with the radical act of deciding you are worthy of love simply because you exist. You can love your parents and still need to heal from the ways they shaped you, and you can be grateful for what they gave while grieving what they couldn't give. You can hold both truths at the same time and start building a life where your worth is not determined by anyone else's ability to see it. If any of this resonated with you and made you feel less alone in what you have been carrying, please hit that subscribe button because we are going to keep having these honest conversations about the things that shape us and how we can start to reshape ourselves. See you in the next one. Till then, take care.